Hi, everyone, and welcome to Together What If. I'm with Jamie, and we're talking about today who has access to God. And we're talking from Psalm 24. So I'm going to read that for us. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and its inhabitants too. Because God is the one who established it on the seas, God has set it firmly on the waters. Who can ascend to the Lord's mountain? Who can stand in his holy sanctuary? Only the one with clean hands and a pure heart, the one who hasn't made false promises, the one who hasn't sworn dishonestly. That kind of person receives blessings from the Lord and righteousness from the God who saves. And that's how things are with the generation that seeks him, that seeks the face of Jacob's God. Selah.
So how are we to approach God? What will get us into the presence of God? Is it the person with the loudest voice, the most money, most popular, most influential, or with the most power? How and who gets access to God? One of the Israelites' fundamental beliefs is that God resides in the temple. Therefore, the temple in Jerusalem was the house of God. And in Jewish thinking, Solomon's temple was the place where heaven and earth intersected. It was the location where the portal to heaven was opened. On Sabbath days, as worshipers approached Solomon's temple, they would sing Psalm 24, "Who can ascend the Lord's mountain?" referring to Jerusalem, and "Who can stand in the holy sanctuary?" referring to Solomon's temple. So who gets access to God? And the priest replies, only the one with clean hands and a pure heart, the one who hasn't made false promises, the one who hasn't sworn dishonestly. The psalm writer does something remarkable in reminding the people as they approach the temple in their worship that the requirements to enter the sacred space are not ritual, but moral. Clean and pure are ethical terms. So if you're not walking with integrity, you cannot show up in this holy place of divine and human intersection and expect to hear from God. The entrance requirements are truth-telling and honesty. True worship begins not when we walk into a church, but when we treat one another with love and respect. So what is one takeaway that we can glean from this passage? And I believe it's this: worship shapes our identity. Since worship is connected to integrity, our act of worship shapes us into a person that reflects the love of God and the love of neighbor. Our worship flows out of our daily lives. Also know, as followers of Jesus, we reflect on the question, who can ascend and who can stand? And we realize that we're not in a position to approach God because our hands are not clean and our hearts are not pure. So we can't climb to God. So what does God do? God climbs down to us, becomes one with us. God stretches out on a cross and with open arms invites us into his holy presence. God doesn't sit on his throne waiting to receive our sacrificial offerings. Instead, God runs out to meet us, goes out like a good shepherd to find his lost sheep, and searches for every lost one of us until the holy banquet is filled with sinners and saints alike. And God is still climbing down to meet us, offering us forgiveness and extending to us his amazing grace. So when we gather to worship, we gather in response to his gracious act of meeting us on a dead-end road and inviting us to walk with him into his holy presence. And this is the person that the psalmist would call blessed.
Be thou my vision, O Lord of my
Jamie, as a person who follows Christ, and I read this psalm, I've always thought to myself, well, I guess I wouldn't be going to church because I don't have clean hands and I don't have a pure heart. So I was really glad to hear you bring that around to Grace today.
Absolutely. And I as a person of Christ, I think that could be a stumbling block for us, but to remind us that Christ goes before us and prepares that way for us.
Yeah, but you make a great point of like worship is more than just being at church. And I kind of flesh that out a little bit because you're saying this psalm was used in worship for the Israelites.
Sure. So just a little bit of background I think
Yeah.
is important for this. So Psalm 24 and Psalm 15, for example, are both what we call entry psalms or processional psalms. And so if you think about it, the people of Israel, Solomon's temple, when it stood, when it was dedicated in 1 Kings chapter 15, I believe, it says that as the priests were walking out, the glory of the Lord just rested on that place. So the part of their fundamental belief is that God's presence resides in the temple.
Oh, yeah, and that's how I grew up as a Christian. Church was God's house, right? This is where he dwells. So you think that comes from
Absolutely.
some of that? Okay.
Absolutely. And so the idea is so on Sabbath or on some of their festival days, as the worshipers are making their procession towards the temple, this is a psalm that they would actually sing.
Okay.
And so if the words that the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it. But then as you get to verse 3, the question is asked. So it's almost like a liturgy.
Yeah.
So the priest the priest is reading or singing. And then in verse 3, the people are going to start asking, well, who can ascend or who can stand? Well, the priest will respond. The priest responds, those with a clean hands and pure hearts. They who do not lift up their souls to what is false and do not swear deceitfully.
Gotcha. So what you're saying is that there is a connection between how we experience the wonder and majesty of God and how we're living life and how we're treating one another. I notice a theme in your sermons a lot of times. Jamie is very concerned with not just how we act out our faith inside the building, but how we're living our faith outside the building.
Absolutely, and I just think that is something that runs through Scripture, and and so whether it be in Psalms or Isaiah's asking that question, what should I bring before the Lord? Micah asked that question, what shall we bring before the Lord? And it's to walk humbly, to do good.
Yeah.
And so yes, there is a connection between. You can't separate worship and ethics in our tradition.
Right. When I read this the first time, I read it through the lens of God doing. Like, we are the worshipers, and so when I saw the word worship and worship coming in your talk, my first question was, well, what is worship? I know what it is for me, but if we ask all the people who were watching this right now, what is worship? They would say a lot of different things. And I will just say that we are new UGA fans because we have a student, our son is there. And when I go to a football game, it has all the elements of worship, right? There's sacred music. Everyone is adoring the same thing. Of course, it's not sacred worship, but it seems our hearts are bent to want to adore and lift up and be in awe and reverence before something, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. If you read like Facebook posts or listen to conversations that people have, they wouldn't use the word worship because that sounds very idolatrous, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Of course.
But the sentiment is there.
Yes.
The emotions are there, and they're being driven to that. So. But what's fascinating is that, yes, I believe being part of what it means to be created in the image of God is there's this longing in us for worship, to give praise toward something which we have given value to.
That's right.
Does that make sense?
Yes. And so the kind of worship that you do is going to grow out of this lived experience with God and others. So like as I walk daily with God and I have this long experience of his faithfulness and his way of transforming me to love other people, then my worship will be different. It'll be richer. It will, and especially when we come together with other people and they're shared, we're missing that a lot right now. Feeling like we're not as safe and able to worship together, and yet we miss one another,
We do, and because it is corporate. Worship
It
is
is.
corporate. It's something we do together, which brings back to the idea of it being ethics. Because, if it's not corporate, then you don't really associate worship with our integrity or ethics, because
Yeah.
I don't really care about what you're doing. But if we say that worship is something we do together, then all of a sudden I need to start thinking about how I'm interacting with this other person, or how am I communicating with this person. Is it in a God uplifting way?
Yeah, and it seems to me in this scripture, as we close today, that it's not just talking about our personal piety, right? This is a corporate song.
Absolutely.
Okay, can you speak to that a little bit? Because I know that's important to you, that what we do, that this is not just individual, right?
So here's what I would say is that one of my things that I keep going back to is that we have privatized the scriptures, or we have individualized the scriptures. And you're exactly right. This is a corporate psalm for a community of people who sing it together. So as I'm processing toward Solomon's temple, I'm thinking to myself, when the priest says, well, who can ascend, who can have access to God? And he says, those with clean hands and a pure heart. Then that automatically would make me think, how have I treated my neighbor this week?
Yes.
And how has
Yes.
that played out in my daily life?
And Jesus comes right back to it and says, if you have something against your neighbor, leave your offering and go make it right, and then come back.
Exactly. Matter of fact, I will argue on Sunday morning in this message. So if you're in Gainesville or around Gainesville, we'd love for you to join us.
Come to the building.
Absolutely. So, because I'm going to argue that I think one of Jesus's inspirations for the Sermon on the Mount was actually this passage.
Really?
Yeah.
My mind is officially blown.
So let's go.
Let's go. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I've enjoyed it. And
And listen, so what we want is people who are spiritually seeking to connect with us. So we're going to put a text number down below, and your call to action today is to text that number and to connect with us, because together, what if?